Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 31. In this week's episode, I want to talk about self-neglect, and more specifically, how it can sometimes relate to this false sense of urgency that so many of us develop and carry with us as a result of being raised by emotionally immature parents. So let's dive right into it. Self-neglect for me feels very self-explanatory. It feels like consistently sacrificing my own thoughts, ideas, and feelings for the sake of someone else. And while I do think there are times in our lives when this can be a positive or even a healthy behavior to kind of take this step back, to take the backseat role and to prioritize someone else's wants and needs, someone in our life that we care about, I think that self-neglect develops when this becomes a pattern, when you repeatedly find yourself putting everyone else before yourself. I remember when I first moved in with my husband, I stopped doing almost everything that my husband didn't also like or didn't have an interest in, because I was conditioned to believe that the way to make a connection with someone, the way for a relationship to work, was through self-sacrificing behaviors, where I have to take on all of your wants, needs, and interests as my own so that we can have some kind of a connection. And looking back, it's so clear the connection between how I felt in those early days of my relationship with my husband when we were first living together and a lot of experiences throughout my childhood. And I think one of the first ways that emotionally immature parents will condition their child to neglect themselves is through a lack of direct communication. It's no secret that emotionally immature and narcissistic parents alike struggle to directly communicate how they're feeling. And so if they are upset or angry about something, rather than using their words to tell you how they're feeling and what they want to do to rectify the situation to make it better, there might just be a small change in tone or mood. Their mannerisms might change. There might be a notable shift in the energy in the room. And what happens, I think, when you're exposed to that kind of behavior over and over again, you start to feel like it's your responsibility to pick up on these really little breadcrumbs of clues that will help to inform you about how your parent is feeling and in turn, how you should act moving forward. And that, I think, is where a lot of this hypervigilance that so many of us deal with comes from. I think in a lot of cases, hypervigilance can be traced back to a lack of direct communication throughout our childhood. And I think hypervigilance in a lot of ways is a form of self-neglect. Because when you start to hyperfixate on how someone else is feeling, which in truth is not something that you can control, you can't regulate another person's emotions for them. You can't always predict their reactions and diffuse a situation that might cause them some stress or frustration. And yet so many of us try to do that. We take on that responsibility as our own throughout our childhood because we feel like the more emotionally mature person in that relationship. But when you're dealing with this hypervigilance and you're hyperfixated on someone else's mood and behavior and reactions, that leaves very little space for self-reflection, for any kind of introspection, for you to actually look inward and ask yourself some really important fundamental questions like, how am I feeling? What do I think about this? There's really no space for that because you're so preoccupied with someone else and it becomes all-consuming. I remember feeling like the only way to create and maintain any kind of a relationship or connection with my emotionally immature parent was through self-sacrifice. Like I had to be there for them. I had to show up for them and take on their opinions and interests as my own. And I think that is really reflective of my behavior when I first moved in with my husband. I felt like whatever he wanted to do, whatever he was interested in, I should want to do those things too, because that is the foundation of a relationship. That is the way that I create a connection with someone that I'm looking to receive attention and affection from. Or so I thought. And I think that idea is reinforced when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, because on the rare occasion parent that you actually prioritize yourself. When you fight for something to go and do something that you really want to do, or to go and do something on your own, despite the tension or the frustration and the discomfort that that might cause, that so often I think is where disconnection comes into play. If you stop taking that back seat for even just an instant, your parent might stonewall you, they might give you the silent treatment, do all of these different things to kind of guilt you back into that position of self-sacrifice, where you're neglecting your own wants, needs, and desires for them. And so it can be really hard to take yourself out of that role when for so long you've experienced disconnection as a result of putting yourself first, of filling your own cup and prioritizing your own wants and needs, as opposed to completely neglecting yourself and only ever showing up for your parent, someone you really care about. And I do think that there's this added layer of safety that comes into play when you're dealing with a parent-child relationship, because you have that inherent power dynamic that's in play. And especially in those earlier years when we're not yet able to support ourselves, I think you want to feel a connection with your parent. That feels safe, to feel like you are in their good graces, like you have an open line of communication with them, like they are going to take care of you. And it's unfortunate, but I think when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you'll do anything to ensure that that connection remains as strong as it possibly can, even if that means completely sacrificing everything about your own reality and existence. I remember feeling throughout my childhood, on more occasions than I can count, like I never wanted to add any fuel to the fire. Like my emotions, my thoughts, my feelings were completely secondary to whatever it was that my parent was going through. And I think it brings to the surface the idea of parentification, which is not uncommon when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, for their child to be parentified, which basically just means they assign to you either physical or emotional tasks that are far beyond your current capabilities. And yet, again, I think we take on those responsibilities. We take on this role where we feel that even as a child, we have this power to somehow make our parents happy, to solve all of their problems, and maybe to get our family back on track. Because sometimes your efforts to diffuse an argument or to come in and be positive reinforcement during a frustrating situation, sometimes they work. But they work in the short term. And so you feel a little bit of gratification for a short period of time, but then a couple of days something else happens and it doesn't work. And so it can be really easy to kind of get stuck in this cycle of trying and having a bit of gratification, but then that effort wearing off and maybe not working the same in the next couple of days, because the mood of your parent is ever changing. It can be so volatile and unpredictable. And yet that little bit of gratification is like a ray of hope. And so we get stuck in this cycle because we're constantly searching, we're constantly after that little bit of gratification where our parent was actually happy and satisfied with whatever it was that we were doing. I think we feel like we're doing our job in that moment when our parent is actually satisfied with how we're showing up for them. And yet it's so inherently backwards reflecting on it now, because throughout our childhoods, our parents are supposed to be the ones who are showing up for us and offering us that emotional support and reassurance and guidance. But when you're parentified as a child, you're doing that for your parent. That is very much your role. And I remember feeling like that for the majority of my childhood, for the majority of my time living with my parents. Like I was the more emotionally mature person in that relationship. And again, it doesn't leave very much time for self-reflection. It doesn't allow you the time or space to check in with yourself and ask yourself, well, how am I doing? How do I feel about this? Instead, you're kind of encouraged to cast your own feelings aside and take on this mentality where it's, oh no, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Like I can handle this. How are you feeling? You feel like that's the role that you have to take. It's very self-sacrificing, and it can at times throughout childhood feel like a noble thing to do. I think so often children who are parentified hear from other adults, even those who don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Oh, you're so mature for your age. You're such an old soul. You're like a little adult. And when you're a kid, all you want to be is a grown-up. And so when you have other people in your life telling you that you are like a little grown-up, it feels good. You feel like you're doing the right thing on top of that positive reinforcement that you're receiving from your parent. But the truth of the matter is, we're taking on these really complex adult issues and emotions that are far beyond our capabilities. And in reflecting on this particular aspect of my childhood and how self-neglect has kind of followed me into my adult life, I find myself asking the question, if our parents, our primary caretakers, the people who are supposed to be guiding us, are not prioritizing how we're feeling, how are we going to ever learn to do that ourselves? If we were never taught, if we were never shown by example, if the only way we think we can make a connection with someone is by completely foregoing our own experience and being there consistently for another person, always putting them and their interests, their wants, their needs before our own. But this can become a really damaging pattern, especially as you move into adulthood. I think when you're dealing with emotionally immature parents, boundaries more often than not are non-existent. I remember learning about boundaries for the first time in my early 20s after I had moved out, and it was eye-opening, to say the least, because I never felt throughout my childhood like I could say no, or don't do that, or that makes me uncomfortable. Can you not say that because you hurt my feelings? I always felt like however I was feeling or what I was thinking was so much less significant than whatever it was my parents said or did, or what they were conveying to me that I should be doing or saying or feeling. I think my inherent feelings, the things that I was experiencing personally, never felt like they carried very much weight, I guess. And so I always felt like the secondary person in that parent-child relationship. So who was I to draw a line in the sand and to say, don't do that again? I didn't feel like I had any kind of authority. I didn't feel like my words carried any weight. And I thought that that was just the way that it was. I thought that's how every parent-child relationship was. It feels inferior in a way. I think in reflecting on how I felt in those times, I think I felt very much inferior to my parent, like my wants and needs were inferior to their own. And that's not a good feeling. But when you're continually exposed to that kind of behavior and you're existing in that environment, you kind of settle into that role and you accept that for what it is. And I think a lack of boundaries is another way that emotionally immature parents condition their child to neglect themselves. Because if you're never taught that it's okay to say no, then anyone will be able to do anything to you without any kind of consequence or repercussion or even communication at the very basic level. And this, I think, feeds into a lot of people-pleasing tendencies, which go hand in hand with hypervigilance, I think. For me, hypervigilance can still sometimes be a challenge. I still default to taking on the role of being the positive reinforcement anytime I sense a shift in tone or mood or behavior. I instinctually just sense those things. I don't even go out of my way to try to pick up on them. I'm just hyper aware of my surroundings and more specifically how the people in my surroundings are carrying themselves. What is their tone like? Have their mannerisms changed? I can pick up on these very slight changes because I was conditioned to do so throughout my childhood, and that can be a very difficult thing to shake. It can be positive if we can channel that into something more positive where we can read a room and we can use it to benefit us socially, but it can be a hard thing to balance or manage, I guess, to turn on and off when it does serve you. So now we've got this connection between hypervigilance and people-pleasing tendencies, and also a gross lack of boundaries that all contribute to self-neglect and self-sacrifice. And for me, it manifests itself in strange ways sometimes, but I just carry with me this constant feeling like I never want to be an inconvenience to anyone that I'm around. I never want to be a burden. And that can be everything from asking someone to do me a favor, to go out of their way to help me with something, all the way down to just speaking about how I'm feeling. Maybe I'm burdening someone with my own emotions or experience. I think when you're raised by emotionally immature parents and you're conditioned to believe that self-neglect is a noble behavior, you feel like you shouldn't want or need anything, like you can get by on breadcrumbs. And one of the ways that this showed up in my life not too long ago, which I thought was really interesting, was I was watching a video with my husband on his phone, and it was a horizontal video. So he unlocked the orientation of his phone and turned it so that we can see the video on the full screen. And I remember thinking to myself in that moment, I never do this for myself. I don't take the half a second that it takes to unlock the orientation of my phone, flip it so that I can get the best viewing experience, so that I can fully enjoy this video, because I don't feel like I deserve to take that extra step to make that a better experience for me, because no, don't worry about me. This is good enough. I can see it just fine. It's the same idea if my husband's heating up leftovers and I get my plate and it's still a little cold. I can just eat it, because no, it's good enough as it is. You don't have to get back up and put it in for longer. Like, don't even worry about it. And these are still feelings that I carry with me, even as I'm in a healthy relationship. But when you're conditioned for so long to believe that you shouldn't want or need anything, that you shouldn't indulge, you shouldn't ever show up for yourself in the same way that you show up for other people, it can be really challenging to teach yourself that behavior. And then there's this false sense of urgency that so many of us develop and carry with us. And this is something that I experienced for a really long time without ever knowing what it was or being able to put words to this feeling or to this experience. I just remember so many different instances catching myself rushing, moving way too fast, faster than I need to be, like I've got somewhere to go, even though I don't, and occasionally just catching myself and reminding myself to slow down, that I don't have anywhere to be. And I started asking myself, why am I rushing? I think I had this imaginary finish line in my head that I was constantly racing towards, but never actually crossing. And once I discovered that this feeling was a false sense of urgency, and I started to understand that it could be a trauma response, when I was in those moments, I really started to try to ask myself, where is this feeling coming from? And I remember cooking dinner with my husband one night, and we were both in the kitchen cooking dinner, and I left the room to go and switch the laundry. So I was in a different room, I was in a different part of the house, and I left him alone doing this thing that we were doing. And I found myself in the laundry room just moving at lightning speed. I felt this pull back to the kitchen, back to my husband, like I need to get back there as quickly as possible. And I started to ask myself, why do I feel like I need to be back there as fast as I possibly can? What's the rush? And that was when I made one of these first connections between self-neglect and a false sense of urgency. And it's all centered around trust. I feel this pull back to the kitchen because I feel like my presence is needed. And I started to connect the dots between that feeling and experiences throughout my childhood, and everything started to make so much more sense. I never felt like I could trust my parent to handle situations. Minor frustrations could turn into massive blow-ups. A change of plans could go one way or the other, and there really was no telling how my parent would handle that. Sometimes someone might say something to trigger my parent, and if I wasn't there to immediately diffuse the situation, well, there goes the rest of the day. And so I started to realize that I felt like I couldn't trust my partner to handle whatever it was that came his way while he was cooking dinner. Maybe something dropped on the floor. Maybe he spilled something or he burned something. This minor inconvenience. Well, I better be there to act as the positive reinforcement so that we can make it through the night. And then I started to realize that my partner is perfectly capable of handling whatever inconveniences life throws his way. He can diffuse a situation. He can regulate his own emotions. He can deal with a problem without taking it out on me. And that was a real moment, I think, for me, a real sort of epiphany where I realized that I can slow down because I trust that my partner can handle himself when I'm not around. And that has been really beneficial in me letting go of that false sense of urgency, just knowing, having that comfort and that confidence in him that he'll be fine when I'm not there. And then there's another side to it. It's no secret, again, when we're dealing with emotionally immature or narcissistic parents, that they thrive on control. They thrive on enmeshment. They like to be involved in every single aspect of their child's life and vice versa. And so anytime you want to branch out, there's a lot of stress and tension and negativity that can surround that experience. So I remember feeling throughout my childhood and even throughout my teens, this constant pull to be home. Always to be home, to be available to my parent and to my family, whatever they need from me, I'm there to provide it. And so there was this inherent sort of negativity that surrounded experiences of mine outside of my house, outside of my immediate family. And I think that also kind of contributes to that false sense of urgency, because I felt like anytime I went out and did something for me on my own, I knew that there was a possibility that with every minute that ticked by, my parent was getting more and more upset and frustrated, and I was going to bear the wrath of that when I got back home. And so that kind of made a bit more sense for me in terms of always feeling like I was rushing. I think on some level, I feared upsetting my partner if I was away for too long. And I think I also felt a need to be available to him, because relationships with emotionally immature parents can feel very transactional, where they will give you love and support and positivity as long as you do what they expect you to do, what they want you to do. And I think a lot of times that's just being available for them. It's providing them with that supply that they crave, that they need so badly. And yet always being available for someone else is a form of self-neglect, because you don't allow yourself the time or space to do the things that feel true to you. And, there's this rigidity, I think, that comes into play when you're dealing with emotionally immature parents. Mental flexibility, I think, is a sign of emotional maturity. If plans change slightly, there's a 50-50 chance when you're dealing with a parent like this that it will be acceptable or unacceptable. Because I think emotionally immature parents have very low tolerance and very high reactivity. They're very unpredictable. And I think when we're dealing with filling our own cup, nourishing ourselves, doing the things that feel true to us, for me anyway, I feel like the more immersive those experiences can be, whether you're exercising or painting or you're hanging out with a friend and you're having a really great conversation, when you can allow yourself to be fully immersed in that experience where the clock kind of falls away and you lose track of time. Those are such memorable experiences, and that, I think, is where a lot of personal growth comes into play, because maybe you develop this new level of emotional connection with someone during this conversation, or maybe you learn something about yourself in the time that you're spending alone with yourself, focused on your own interests. And yet, that all feels so secondary, because nothing feels worse than the disconnection or disapproval of a parent. You want them to be proud of you. You want them to love you and to think that you're doing well. And when something like getting lost in a conversation and coming home 10 minutes late can either be perfectly okay, or depending on the day and the mood that they're in, it might mean that you're a terrible person and that family means nothing to you. How could you possibly stay out for 10 minutes later? You said you would be home at this time. You're so untrustworthy. I think receiving that kind of wrath, I think being so personally attacked for something as minor as a change of plans, getting home 10 minutes later than you said, there's so much weight to that it's really easy to sacrifice your ability to get lost in those experiences. I think you don't really allow yourself to not be thinking about the time. I still, to this day, am so aware of the time, what time of day it is, how long I'm spending on a particular task or whatever it is that I'm doing right in front of me. I'm very aware of the time, and I can't help but feel like it stems from those experiences where if I said that I would be home at 7:30 for dinner, but I stopped and got gas on the way home and now it's 7:40, maybe it's okay, or maybe I don't care about sitting down and eating dinner with my family anymore. How could I? You said you would be home at this time and now the food is cold and we were all waiting, and you know what? It doesn't even matter. Forget about it. The guilt and the sadness that you can feel as a result of doing some very normal things is paramount. And I think that takes precedence over your own wants, needs, and interests, because they just don't feel worth it. I remember throughout my teenage years, especially when I was in high school, willingly missing out on experiences with my friends and with peers of mine because, one, it wasn't worth the argument to get there, and two, I felt more of a responsibility to be there, to be available for my parent. I didn't feel like experiencing these things or going out and doing these things that are very normal and natural for a 15, 16-year-old kid to want to do. They just didn't feel as important. Again, it's that same mentality. Oh no, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Really, I didn't even want to go. No, let's go and do this thing that you want to do anyway. It's you're constantly appeasing another person, and the flip side of that is that you're constantly neglecting yourself. And it can be really challenging to allow yourself the time and space to prioritize yourself. I still sometimes feel a sense of guilt or uncertainty anytime I directly communicate how I'm feeling, or I set a boundary, or I spend a little bit longer than I said I was going to on something that is more me-centered. It's something that I was doing for myself, maybe by myself. It can be hard to feel like that's okay, like you're not a bad person for doing that, like you're not going to get punished or upset someone for doing that. But I think one of the best ways to kind of fight against this and to overcome this self-neglect is to allow yourself that time and space to be a little more experimental or exploratory with yourself. Practice directly communicating how you're feeling. Practice allowing yourself to indulge. You have to kind of reintroduce this idea to yourself that you're worth it, that you deserve to do all of these things. You deserve to foster your ideas. You deserve to dig a little bit deeper into your interests to see what really speaks to you. You are just as deserving of doing all of those things as anyone else. It's not your responsibility to always only ever show up for other people. And what I've started to realize is the more that I show up for myself in that way, it inevitably sort of trickles down into the other relationships in my life where I can show up for them in a really positive way, where I can actually contribute something unique to this experience or to this relationship. It's very different than being raised by an emotionally immature parent when there's so much enmeshment where you're encouraged to be an extension of another person. I think relationships really thrive when you have two individuals that bring something unique to the table and can complement one another and offer up these different perspectives. And the only way that you're able to develop that individuality is through, I'll call it, self-nourishment instead of self-neglect. And it comes with time and it comes with practice, I think. And it comes with communication, especially if you're dealing with a relationship. I think it's so important to communicate to your partner how you're feeling, what your boundaries are, and to feel comfortable and justified in sharing your thoughts and sharing your ideas without feeling like you're a burden to someone. I think the more you do this, maybe you tell your husband or your wife or your boyfriend, girlfriend that you're going to be home at this time and you show up 10 minutes later and everything is okay. Experiencing that mental flexibility, I think, will start to rewire your brain in a way where you no longer expect negativity anytime you don't sacrifice whatever it is that you're doing or feeling. I think I have found a lot of comfort in the relationships that I have in my life now and the emotional maturity that come along with them. I think not only has it allowed me to let go of that false sense of urgency, but I think it's also allowed me, and these relationships have encouraged me to look inward and to ask myself those very important foundational questions, like, how am I feeling? What do I think about this? And take the time to actually form my own opinion and allow myself to have the experiences where I can pull on something to have this opinion. Maybe now I have an experience that I can draw from. And it's been really fulfilling, I want to say. I think when you are able to let go of the fear and the selfish feelings that can come along with putting yourself first, and start to really believe that taking the time to take care of yourself, that treating yourself in a way that you would treat someone in your life that you really care about, is a positive and a healthy thing. It's a thing that people in your life who love you should want you to do and encourage you to do. There's a sense of calm, I think, and relief that comes along with that, because now you feel like you can be yourself. You can start to get to know who you really are in a safe space, and the time you spend doing that won't negatively impact the relationships in your life with the people that you care about. With that, I think I'm going to wrap this week's episode up. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to leave us a rating. And I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.